Okay, so we're back in track. We're a little late, but it's fine. So I have the pleasure to present to you our second speaker for today, Dorian Greenbaum. She has been studying Hellenistic Greek traditions in the history of astrology. So you all know her. She has her famous big book on the diamond in Hellenistic astrology, quite a reference work. And today she's going to talk about the origins and questions in astrology. Thank you, Dorian.
Okay, thank you very much, Luis. I'm happy to be here today. So I'm going to be looking at the origins of questions in astrology. This is a complicated topic, both by its own history, what we have of it, and the history ascribed to it by scholarship. And on that latter topic, I'm not going to be litigating previous positions today, but try to look at this material with, I hope, a fresh eye. And in looking at this history, I will be exploring evidence from the period in which it developed, using sources both within and outside of astrology proper. I'll also include relevant material prior to the development of Hellenistic astrology, as well as a bit about its afterlife in the medieval period. So I plan to show its divinatory background, its connections with other forms of divination, its practitioners, and its methods in practice. And a crucial component of this talk is the genre of kataric astrology and how implicit and explicit questions are at the heart of this genre. Now, before I begin, I want to acknowledge a debt to two astrologers whose work has stimulated my own thoughts and research on this topic, and that is Jeffrey Cornelius and Deborah Holding. I have corresponded and met with both of them over many years and discussed the topics that I will bring up today, and I've benefited immensely from their insights. So, to start, I just want to show you a slide on the branches of astrology as it was practiced in antiquity. And these are not necessarily the divisions we see in ancient writings, but a practical division based on the categories of related practices. And I want to first draw your attention to the fact that kataric astrology I consider to be really an umbrella term that includes 4 different but related kinds of astrology, namely elections, events, interrogations, and decumbiture. I want to say just a little bit about this third category of interrogations, which are charts cast for a time a question is asked. But related to interrogations in this sense are charts cast for the time when someone found out about an event, such as a wife leaving her husband. And these are interpreted in the same way as a question about whether a wife will return to her husband. So you have a relationship there between an event you don't know the time of, and then you ask the question to find out the answer to that question. And I want you to keep in mind that all these branches or subsets of kataric astrology are using similar rules and methods and are connected in similar ways by a common goal, and that is to find out what is going to happen, what we can do about it, and how to obtain the best outcome. Kataric astrology is concretely connected to divination, religion, and ritual, and it derives directly from astral omens that were interpreted as messages from the gods and used to ask for assistance from the gods. It is also connected to oracles, and some kinds of questions asked of oracles are not dissimilar to the kinds of questions asked in kataric astrology. So this is where I want to begin, with the idea of asking the gods for answers about the past, present, and future, with omens and oracles and other ways of finding out what the gods want us to do and how they communicate with us. So I'm going to go very quickly through a number of traditions in the Mediterranean region that are relevant for us today. I'm going to begin with Babylon and sky omens and inquiries. The tradition of Mesopotamian celestial omens is the oldest in the Mediterranean world, and it is fundamentally connected with signs. So a sign in the sky, correctly interpreted, correlates with an event on Earth. The world is a system of signs waiting to be interpreted, as you can see in this famous quotation from the Diviner's Manual. And in this case, the sky is divine and the signs are from the gods. This kind of material uses what's called the protasis-apodosis form. So if X is in the sky, this will correlate with Y on Earth. And you can see here an example of this from the Enuma Anu Enlil Omen series. We must note that if X then Y format, these two items were not necessarily consecutive or dependent, but rather relational. They had a resemblance to one another, and the two sides correlate with each other. And this correlation and interrelationship between the omen and the event on Earth is the foundation of any kind of divinational attitude, including the basis for astrology itself. And we should also keep in mind that these practices are not forecasting an immutable future, in fact, the opposite. The future revealed by the omen opens a dialogue between gods and humans in which an outcome could be changed or ameliorated by human action in response to the omen. And this is the underlying premise of kataric astrology too. The kataric rationale exists because of the possibility of changing the future by understanding it in the context of both past and present and finding a way to negotiate being in harmony with heavens while obtaining the best outcome. In Babylon, we also find liver divination and extispicy, and this is a significant form of divination in Mesopotamia. And here I want to point out that conclusions based on astral observation could be refined through extispicy. So the entrails of the animal were frequently called a tablet inscribed by the gods, and the sky also was called a tablet that was inscribed by the gods. So we will see a similar phenomenon when we get to Etruscan divination. The Mesopotamians also used hemerologies and monologies, and these were for finding favorable days for performing certain actions or rituals, and associated with the right or propitious days for these. The Assyrian word, Adanu, which in Sumerian is Udakam, is the word for this propitious or fateful day, and there is an interesting similarity of meaning here with the Greek word kairos, which is also associated with divination and the proper time of beginning a ritual. Earlier hemerologies, I should point out, were later correlated to zodiac signs in the Persian period. Now I'm going to move quickly to Egypt. I'm not going to say too much, but just talk about a couple of different kinds of divination that's relevant. First, oracles, which are very relevant for us when we come to astrology. In Egypt, oracles have their earliest attestation in the reign of Hatshepsut, and here we would have a god being paraded in his bark, and people would ask questions of him publicly. We also have dream books, and as you can see, this is an example from a dream book that uses, again, this protasis form, so the if-then format. And there are also hemerologies and monologies in Egypt. Herodotus talks about something like this, and we also have, and that is in your handout, number 1.1, if you want to take a look at that later. And we also have examples here of lucky and unlucky days, and I've given you an example of a bad day here on the screen and an example of a good day. So that's what's going on in Egypt, much earlier than the main period which I'll be discussing today. But now I want to move to the Greek tradition. The Greeks also have propitious and unpropitious days. There's an example 1.2 in your handout from Hesiod's Works and Days, giving a passage from that. And we also have oracles. Greece is quite famous for oracles. And I'm just going to show you quickly here a list of the topics of oracle questions. These are taken from the oracle of Zeus at Dodona, and this is from Esther Eidnow's 2007 book on the oracle at Dodona. So these are the typical kinds of topics that you would encounter, or that would be used in asking oracle questions. And here, very quickly, is a list of typical oracle questions. We're going to be seeing a lot more of that later. But for now, let me move on to the last topic that I want to bring up in this section, and that is Etruscan and Roman traditions. In Etruscan, liver divination and its astral components. So this is a very definite model that shows the relationship of the liver, representing the earth, and the sky. So the liver is divided into 16 sections that each is correlated with the divinity and a portion of the sky. And so it demonstrates the connection between liver divination and celestial divination, especially through lightning, which was an Etruscan specialty. And in an astrological context, the divinities of certain regions will correlate with places in what's called the Circle of Athla, which is a doctrine outlined in Manilius. And we'll be looking at that later in connection with kataric astrology. And finally, I just want to say a little bit about augury and the sky. Here you have two handouts, 1.3 and 1.4. This was a practice traceable to the early kings of Rome. And in handout 1.3, we see Numa in 1.3 and Romulus in 1.4 making auguries. So Livy tells us that Numa offered prayers and marked out the heavenly regions by an imaginary line from east to west. The southern he defined as the right hand, and the northern as the left hand. Now, this is the same orientation as the astrological chart. So if you look east towards the ascendant, then south is on your right and north is on your left. And also notice that he mentions the word templum here as a sacred area. And this is later the term that Manilius uses to denote the astrological places. So in this quotation, Numa was following the augural practice of his predecessor Romulus, who also looks for favorable signs in the sky, and that the best place to take the auspices, again, is looking east where the sun rises. So the same orientation, again, here that's important in astrology. All right, so after that sort of whirlwind tour, I want to turn to divination and astrology. Because as the structure and mechanics of what we call Hellenistic astrology develops in the Mediterranean region, its practice as divination, with the means and methods for fulfilling the desire to know what the gods want us to do, and their means of communicating this to us through the sky comes through as well. These methods produce what is called kataric astrology, and what you saw earlier we often call by separate names: elections, events, interrogations, and decumbiture. And there are two important words associated with its development. The first word, of course, being katarche, which can mean just a beginning or an initiative or an inception. And this is the word also used for the beginning of a ritual. And it is associated with kairos, the second word on your screen, the right and proper time to begin a sacred process. I briefly mentioned kairos when I was talking about a similar concept in Mesopotamian divination, Adanu and Udakam. And this practice comes to intersect with astrology in the form of creating an astrological katarche for a ritual. And I'll show you a couple of examples of this. Porphyry, the philosopher and Neoplatonist, who also knew something about astrology, wrote about the usefulness of astrology in determining the moment for a ritual on consecrating statues. This is a passage from his letter to Nebo, which appears to me to suggest that astrology as divination is being used in an interrogational manner to predict whether the rituals will be successful. The Greek for this is also in your handout in 2.1. And so he is saying that if you have the right time for the ritual, you can determine whether the divination will be true or false, whether the rites performed will be of no purpose or have enunciatory power and be affected. And he uses the word apotelestica here, which is not so far off the astrological term for outcomes, which is apotelesmata. And this passage is actually quoted in Porphyry's fellow Neoplatonist Iamblichus's On the Mysteries, and Iamblichus as well mentions what is, that he is aware of this opportune moment, this kairos, at which theurgic rituals should be begun. He says, without bringing anything other to bear than the observation of the opportune moment, which I think is pretty clear he's referring to an election for a ritual here. So we see some more evidence of this kind of practice. And then we find some more evidence in the late 4th and early 5th century astrologer Hephaestion, where we have two passages in Book 3 that is on kataric astrology totally, representing a ritual here, one making supplication with a prayer and one for an animal sacrifice. These are 2-3 in your handout. So he says that for the supplication, he assigns different roles to the angles of the chart. So the one praying is the ascendant, the sacrifice is the 7th, the 10th is the god, and the 4th has to do with if the prayers are heard and their subject. And then the other passage, where he is talking about the way that you decide about what the part of the ritual before the opening of the animal. So again, the person who's making the sacrifice is the ascendant, the victim is the 7th, the gods are the 10th, and the 4th is the reason for the sacrifice and how it is done. There are interpretations that follow this passage that correlates the parts of the animal, here generalized as the liver, to the planets and the zodiac, and these are a kind of sacrificial melothesia. So the right and left parts of the entrails correlate with the upper and lower hemispheres of the chart respectively, and the planets and signs are each assigned parts of the body. So here we see the same coordination of entrails and sky as in the Etruscan and Babylonian practices of extispicy and hepatoscopy, but now in a specifically astrological setting. So again, we have another connection between other forms of divination and astrological kataric material that is present throughout a millennium of history, if we look at the dates of the Babylonian stuff. And this practice is in fact reminiscent of an Uruk text of the Seleucid period, mentioned by Erika Reiner, that makes the same kinds of correlations between the liver and the gallbladder in this particular instance, with the months of the year, zodiacal signs, and heliacal risings of constellations. So we could imagine that the culmination of such an arrangement lies here in Hephaestion's katarche for a sacrifice, melding liver, signs, and planets together. And other Babylonian texts combine the moon and the zodiac in determining the best time for beginning an activity, causing Reiner to remark that by determining the propitious time for initiating an activity, the genre represents an early example of the process known as katarchic astrology. We also have a comment from another scholar, Boucher-Leclerc's L'Astrologie grecque, who talks about, who's looking at the relationships of the Mesopotamian and Egyptian material to the Greek and Latin, and suggesting that katarchic astrology, in the form of choosing the right moment to begin something, is the oldest form of astrology in those places, based on the practices of its divinatory and omen interpreting forebears. And he even says that natal astrology developed from it. So he's talking about the clients who asked if the moment was favorable or not for such an enterprise, and this kind of method, which is known as initiative or opportunities, was the normal occupation and sustenance of popular astrology. Okay, so now I want to turn to one of the most important phenomena to have an impact on the development of kataric astrology, and that is oracles and astrology. So these are different ways of answering the same questions. And we've already seen a bit about the topics typically asked of oracles, along with the sampling of questions. And now I want to compare these oracle topics with those proposed as questions in kataric astrology. And this list comes from mainly Dorotheus, Book 5, and Hephaestion, Book 3. And so here are the kataric question topics, and here are the oracle topics side by side with them, and you can see the similarities. So let's take a look at some of these typical questions that are asked in kataric astrology. So I'll just let you take a quick look at that. That the wider culture was aware of these kinds of questions being asked, like, will my child live or die? Or where can I find the thief? Or if you're asking about a time when goods are stolen, all these kinds of things. Porphyry, again, says in his letter to Anibo, speaking of those who incorrectly use their knowledge of these things in not seeking the good and union of the divine. And he says, and this is 2:5 in your handout, vain has their study of wisdom been, who worried the divine mind about finding a runaway slave or buying a farm, or if a marriage or business deal should happen. So he's thinking, obviously, of something more elevated than the typical kinds of things that people want to know about events in their lives. Okay, so let me now just put up some kataric questions here on the left with oracle questions on the right. And again, I think you can see that they have a lot of similarities. Not only that, we also see examples of, or evidence of, oracular language in astrology. So in addition to finding similar topics and similar questions in oracles and katarche, there's also evidence of the use of oracular language in at least 2 astrological texts on katarche. That is, one is Maximus of Ephesus's 4th century CE text on initiatives, perikatarchon, where the editor of the text, Nicholas Zito, has examined the style and the language that Maximus uses and has found similarities to oracular language and style. For example, both Maximus and one of the most common formulaic phrases given by the Pythia, we see this also at the oracle at Dodona, this same kind of language, use the words amenon and loion, meaning better or more desirable. So the Pythia will say something like, it is or it will be better and more desirable, loion kai amenon estin or estai. This is also, you can see this also in Greek in your handout in 2:6. And I also, interestingly, discovered that these words can be found in a katarchic context in a passage from Dorotheus on buying and selling, which is excerpted as a direct quotation by Hephaestion in Book 3, Chapter 16. So this is the passage at 2:6. Just in Greek, but I think I've underlined the relevant words. So we find amenon in line 16, loion in line 18, and eset amenon in line 24. We also find the optative mood in both oracles and in katarchic astrology, and in an if-then format, and you can see that also in line 24 on the handout. And there are other examples in Dorotheus that show these same the same kind of mood being used in katarchic questions. Also, Plutarch, in his essay on the E at Delphi, speaks of the religious and prayerful quality present in the use of the word If, A, in Greek, in the questions that petitioners make to the god, and their optative nature. So, if they will be victorious, if they shall marry, if it's to their advantage to sail the sea, if to take to farming, etc. So the point I also want to stress here is that questions are inherent in these practices, not only literally the asking of a question, but in the questions applied to an election, what's the best time to do this, to the chart of an event, what will the outcome of this event be, or a decumbiture, what's the progress of the illness, will the patient recover? In kataric astrology of whatever kind, questions are the main way in which this astrology is practiced. Now, the genre itself is developing out of a divinatory milieu, religious ritual and oracles, to answer the ultimate question, what shall I do and how do I obtain the sanction and advice of the gods? So I think to limit the origin date, if there even is such a thing, of interrogational astrology only to the chart that literally asks a question, and to separate it from this cultural milieu is to ignore the complex interweaving of these different but related kinds of astrological practices. However, I do want to share in my last section the evidence from astrologers. We have little extant evidence that astrologers before the 1st century CE specifically refer to asking a question as part of their discussions of events or elections. We see the technique of electing the time of the founding of a city can be found in Rome in the middle of the 1st century BCE in the work of Varro and Dorotheus. And there's also evidence of early astrologers having competence in other forms of divination. At the top of your screen, like entrail reading and thunder omens by Pseudinus, Posidonius, and Aegidius Figulus. There are 3 other astrologers who could be dated before the 1st century CE or around the turn of the millennium that mention topics in kataric astrology. These are Protagoras of Nicaea, whom Hephaestion mentions, Timaeus, and Demetrius. And you can see the topics that they talk about on the screen there. There is one text by a Hermes Trismegistus about a mystical method that contains 5 references to questioning using forms of erotao and erotasis, which are Greek words for to question and question itself. And so he's coming up with a lot-like technique using the arc from the sun to the moon and casting out by 6s, and I won't get into the method here, but this is where he's using these question words, which are also in your handout at 3.1 more fully written out and with the Greek. But you can see that he's definitely talking about questions. So I'm going to move now to the 1st century CE, and I'm going to begin with someone who has not been mentioned much in discussions on interrogational astrology, and that is Manilius, whose poem Astronomica was written during the reigns of Augustus and Tiberius, and he writes of an interesting practice called the Circle of Athla in Book 3. And this practice uses the lot of fortune as a beginning point for the places of the chart, and each place deriving from the beginning point of fortune has its own set of parameters that are different from the places deriving from the ascendant, as you can see in this slide. So the interpretation of these lot places, I guess we could call them, can be used in natal astrology, but the description of 2 of them, the 11th and 12th, contains some very interesting references to what can only be referring to forms of kataric astrology, namely elections and interrogations. So you can see in the slide that the 11th place from fortune covers health, remedy, and the time for administering it, clearly a reference to an election in the service of astrological medicine. This is your handout 3.2, where he calls the 11th outstanding, and he says this is where you find the choice of remedy in the moment for administering it, or in whose hour therapy and the mixing of life-saving potions have greater efficacy. The 12th this is 3.3 in your handout, is even more overt, effectively answering questions about success in a number of different areas, as you can see on the slide, and whether one should initiate an action or not. Okay, so he says, this is the portion in which the day and hour for decision shall be given if the planets, as they move through the zodiac, are favorably situated. So it's quite clear that these examples of kataric astrology, and particularly the implied interrogations, whether or not to seek fortune on the sea, etc., in another text besides Dorotheus from the 1st century CE, again provide evidence that this type of astrology was being practiced by at least the turn of the millennium. Wolfgang Hübner writes in his book on kataric astrology that since at least the middle of the 1st century CE, the doctrine of kataric astrology is essentially fully developed. So let me now turn to Dorotheus, the other 1st century astrologer, as the most well-known practitioner of kataric astrology. Book 5 of his Carmen Astrologicum is devoted entirely to kataric practice, and I'm going to begin with an example that showed me probably around 2006 that the evidence of asking a question in an astrological context had to date at least to the 1st century CE, when I realized that chapter 17 of Dorotheus's book 5 was duplicated in Greek, not Arabic, in Hephaestio chapter 3:11. And so this is a section on finding out if a wife and husband quarrel and she departs, what will happen if you want to know if she returns to him. So this is from Pingree's English translation of the Arabic on the top of your screen. So he says, if you want to know if she returns to him, whether he'll profit from her, etc., look at the hour in which you are asked about this at the position of the Sun and Venus. In Hephaestio, we see again on separation of married couples that we should look at their separations and return like this. Look at the katarche in which the separation has come to be, that's the event, or even in which hour someone inquires of you, look at Aphrodite and the sun. Well, it's very clear that these are from the same original text, which has to be the Greek text of Dorotheus. Since Hephaestio is earlier than the Arabic version of Dorotheus, he may be even more faithful to the original because it clearly states at the beginning there are two ways of addressing the problem of whether a wife who left home will return by an event chart cast for the moment of her departure or by a chart cast at the moment the astrologer is asked about whether she'll return. So if the client doesn't know when she left and there is no event chart, the time that he questions the astrologer gives us another viable option. The title of the Dorotheus version suggests an event chart, but the first sentence clearly talks about a question being asked to show that, and so depicts an interrogation. Yet later on in the Dorotheus version, he does seem to return to interpreting an event chart for the departure in sentences 7 to 10, where he says, if a woman's departure occurs with the moon opposite sun, etc. So that's clearly an event. But Hephaestio, being closer in time to Dorotheus and writing in the same language, may have retained more of the original Dorotheus, while the Arabic version has slightly adjusted the paragraph by talking about both interrogational and event charts, but not specifically saying that at the beginning of the chapter. Now, so I've talked quite a lot about Dorotheus and his correlations with Hephaestio, who quotes him a lot in Book 3 especially. And so this is just a chart that is truncated for reasons of space here, but a breakdown of the correlations between Dorotheus and Hephaestio. And so of the 43 chapters in Book 5 of Dorotheus, only 5 chapters in Pingree's version have no counterpart in Hephaestio. This is taken from Pingree's original correlation that he did in the critical edition of Hephaestion, and it's also in the Divinatory. And as for the specific mention of questions we find in Dorotheus, I want to show you this table that correlates the asking of questions in the Arabic Dorotheus with the corresponding material in Hephaestion. And you can easily see on the right side of your screen, the last column, that although the only literal asking of a question is in 311, sentences 1 to 5, the chapters on thievery, which you can see in the third column, down at the end, 342 to 346, show clearly that the event chart is being queried in several different ways. So what is the thing lost? Who is the thief? What is the appearance of the thief? And in which way is it lost? And all of these things, as you can see also in this table, have a direct correlation in the sentences of Dorotheus's book 5, chapter 35, that set up the different things the querent's trying to find out. So in my view, this is evidence of the innate interrogational stance of kataric astrology that we've seen earlier in the evidence from oracles and their commonalities with this branch of astrology. So we shouldn't assume that because there's not a literal question, that no such concepts exist until later in the tradition. And the evidence of either one or two examples of this, as in the Hephaestion-Dorotheus correlation between his book 311 and Dorotheus's 517, and the passages in Manilius, are proof of the approach used in this kind of astrology at a much earlier date than some scholarship has suggested. I should also point out that mentioning kataric astrology is not limited to the authors who are writing specifically on its techniques. So this passage from Pulus, which is 3:4 in your handout for the Greek, seems to differentiate between a birth chart and a chart of a day. But this chart of a day, by context, we can deduce as kataric through the topics that are mentioned for that chart of a day. As you can see on the screen, they're very similar to the normal topics of kataric astrology. And there is a text from a later manuscript that claims to be from Manetho the astrologer, who was born 80 CE. It's in prose, not poetry, so its authenticity is questionable, but it illustrates principles that are common in writings on katarkai. And if genuine, it would be another first century witness to katarkai in general. That's the Greek is 3:5 in your handout. So I'd like to now loop back around quickly to Hephaestion and bring up the topic of the astrologer discovering what is on the client's mind. This is 3:6 in your handout. So this is the chapter about what the questioner is thinking. And it's about the chart cast, presumably in advance of the consultation, to discover what it is that the querent is thinking about, called Thought, Interpretation, or Consultation Chart by Benjamin Dykes. But what I like the phrase thought reading. I got that from Deb Holding. And so I think it more accurately describes what's going on here. So he asks how one may learn beforehand the questions of those wishing to investigate from katarkai. And he's saying that you can learn the prior circumstances of those who approach you and want to know predictions, making the inspection, and then he gives them a method to do that. And the method itself is also interesting when we look at that, because part of it is clearly concerned with both past, present, and future. And so this too is a function of divination, not only to see the future, but to understand the past and the present in relation to the future. So he's looking at the midheaven, representing the present, and the places on either side of the midheaven, the decline as the past, and the post-ascension, the 11th, as the future. He also assigns roles to each of the four angles, as we saw earlier. And he uses the lot of fortune and the dodecademarias. This is quite a long chapter on this process. So the concept of casting a chart beforehand to discover what's on the client's mind was previously considered to have an Indian origin, since it appears in the Avanajataka. However, since clearly this long chapter of Hephaestio is devoted to this method, and since Hephaestio, as far as I know, has no Indian connections, I believe the practice is earlier. And we can, in fact, find some earlier evidence for this both in Babylon and in the oracle tradition. So in Babylon, the texts of the medical omen series, called Sakiku, we have tablets 1 and 2 dealing with the omens seen by the doctor or the exorcist on his way to see the patient, that give a preview of the outcome of the illness. And for example, if he sees either a black dog or a black pig, that patient will die. Also, in the evidence of petitioners to Greek oracles, some clients would conceal the topic of their questions, or they had a sealed letter whose contents they wanted to know, and they thought that the god should know all of these things. So the evidence of these two examples is not robust, to be sure, but at least it shows the concept was not unheard of. And now, as the final exploration of this material today, I want to turn to examples of kataric astrology collected much later than when its content first appeared, and this material is found under the name of Pulus. So Pulus is mentioned as the author of kataric, author in quotation marks, kataric horoscopes of the 5th century. The name is a toponym, meaning from Balch, and has been ascribed to Abu Mashar. Whether the material did derive from some text ascribed to Abu Mashar, which is doubtful, or was only transcribed under that name, the material it contains has been noted as from earlier sources by more than one author, including Richard Gordon, whose wonderful article on kataric astrology, Will My Child Have a Big Nose? Great title. I highly recommend you read it. Noted that it was earlier material, and also Roger Beck says much of the material ascribed to Pulus is, of course, considerably older. So it's older than the date of its supposed author. And this is immediately obvious because the questions covered in the multiple-page text devoted to interrogations include things like which charioteer will win, which is not something you would expect an Arabic astrologer to be asking about. Pingree tells us that this Pulus material is a mixture of Hellenistic and early Byzantine texts with Greek translation from the Arabic. The text has been reproduced in 2 well-known manuscripts, but never fully published in a modern edition. The oldest manuscript is Angelicus Graecus 29, ascribed by Pingree to a Byzantine copyist called Eleutherius Elias, who copied it in 1388 and 89. And there is also a copy of Angelicus 29 in Laurentianus Plutius 2833, which is the manuscript you see on your screen here. And they're the major manuscripts for this work. So the texts themselves are collections and compilations of various astrological doctrines, mentioning a number of authors on interrogations and katarche in general, with instructions on how to interpret each question following the question itself. So the collection contains some of the famous interrogation charts of the 5th century, like Leontius crowned at Antioch, and charts of fear of shipwreck, and the linen of a slave girl, etc. These are all in Greek horoscopes. So it would not be unreasonable, I think, to call this part of the compilation a katarchic reader or a primer on katarche for astrologers interested in learning the techniques of this genre. And so here are some of the topics and questions raised in the Pulus material. What is perfectly clear is that the material is older than the date of the compilation, and it was an important enough topic that it survived in 2 major manuscripts on astrological topics. And so in correlating and looking at the 2 manuscripts and their topics, 2 things become immediately clear: that the topics are, first, very similar across centuries and authors, and second, the material being covered is very Hellenistic in tone. So the compiler of the text is keen on presenting a Hellenistic history of katarche in the form of questions. And that this person comes from the Byzantine period is not all that important. What's relevant is that the doctrine and its topics are maintained over hundreds of years, from Dorotheus to Byzantium. Certain practices may be adapted over time. Other interpretive practices may arise, or the emphasis on one practice or another changed, but the foundation is stable. Another point that should be stressed is that there's a lot of material on all forms of kataric, and the sections on interrogations fit right in with the other forms, and the techniques for all these branches are the same. And furthermore, the idea of questioning is present in many of these texts, whether it's a typical horary question about something asked of the astrologer, then casting a chart for that time for the answer, or the questioning of an event chart, questioning involved in the casting of an election, asking questions about the intentions and thoughts of the questioner. All these kinds of charts under the rubric kataric are therefore intimately connected, first by the fact that they're charts cast for something other than a birth, and that second, each of them can be elucidated by asking either one or a series of questions about the topics concerned. And third, that the same astrological rules are used in interpreting these processes. So this again shows the innate and inextricable connection between questions and kataric. So to separate the different forms these take, to divorce them from one another, or to emphasize a hierarchy among them, misses the point about the common theoretical and even cultural basis under which they are conceived. And that interrogations specifically have a different ontological basis, which is a whole other topic, in that they're not cast for a physical space and time moment in which an event occurred, but for the moment that a questioner asks a sincere question, does not seem to be an issue as far as interpretation is concerned for the astrologers practicing in this genre. Even in the early Middle Ages, when interrogational astrology developed further into a distinct category on its own, we may note that Theophilus of Edessa, for instance, who did make this distinction, will still discuss the outcomes of kataric and interrogations together and using the same method. So this explicit, as opposed to what we could say is sometimes an earlier implicit differentiation of interrogations from other kinds of kataric, can be viewed in two ways. It seems to be a later development. In the earlier texts, like the Greek fragments of Dorotheus, do not make a distinction in method for treating the different branches. In Dorotheus's case, elections, events, and questions about events are handled with the same methods. But as I've been pointing out in this talk, the word kataric contains the idea of a beginning in its etymology and in its meanings, a moment in time when something begins, and often with the sense of the proper or right time. So a question does not have the physical space and time basis of the event. Its beginning is in the querent's mind and intention. Its rationale is coming instead from something like the oracle tradition, in which the question as posed is the impetus for the divine response, a question that in its very framework and language shows its prayerful stance and the plea for the god to supply the answer, as we saw earlier with Maximus and Plutarch. This is not so far off the early modern horary stricture that the client must ask the question with a sincere and respectful attitude and no hint of frivolity in order to get a proper answer from the astrologer. And ultimately, it connects with the oracular and ritual strictures that a petitioner must also approach the god with her question in a pious and sincere manner. And this, then, is the ultimate origin of questions in astrology. Thank you. And I apologize, I've probably gone over time.
Well, that was really a masterly account of the origins of interrogation, and very convincing. Very convincing.
Thank you.
And very important. I just have one little thing to add concerning the guessing of the thought of the question.
Yes,
First of all, there's a whole genre in Arabic called Ikhraj al-Damir.
Yes.
Damir, of course, in Arabic means a thought, it's in your mind.
Right.
and intention is a very important word. Dionis, in particular, Dionis guesses what his client is going to do.
Yes,
And
yes.
then you have a letter from Necapso to Petrosiris, when he
Yes.
talks about what the person has in his mind and what he's carrying in his hand.
Yes.
If it's genuinely Egyptian.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I was just talking to Levente at the break, and he mentioned Necapso and Petrosiris. So yes. I know that passage. I didn't bring it up today, partly because time and space and everything else. But those are great suggestions, and I should definitely. We'll talk later. I should definitely look at that material. You're right.
Thank you, Dorian.
Thank you.
I agree, it was masterly. I think somehow you've just exploded the tendency to reduce the term astrological practice to astrological technique, and you've shown that it's not just about the content of what you do. It's much more perhaps about the formalities. You know, what questions do you ask? Why do you ask the questions, etc., etc. So that was extremely helpful. I think I have two things in that respect. The first question is, so if we go along with this, which I'd very much like to do, what are we going to call this thing that you describe from in a long-term perspective? You seem to prefer divination, ritual, alternatively. Of course, many of us work in contexts of the history of astrology, which have a more secular flavor. Let's put it that way. I can imagine that a Foucauldian would say, well, it's spirituality or it's technology of self. Other people would say it's a tactic, etc., etc. I mean, there are many candidates for calling, for labeling this form of life that you've just tried to describe, I suppose. So that's my first question. What, from a long-term perspective of doing history of astrology, what would be a good term that we can work with? And the second question was that interesting passage in Boucher-Leclerc, which I didn't remember, in which he claims that this is the basis of genealogy. Yeah. I'm wondering to hear how he makes that claim, but anyway, those are the two things that I was wondering about.
Okay, yeah, as for what to call, I mean, I'm happy to use the word kataric astrology, but I'm not sure that really answers your concern. And we are way more secular than they were. But I think we could all agree that, as Charles also mentioned, this idea of sincere intention and lack of frivolity. You're not just, and I know there are texts in the Arabic material that try to figure out if the astrologer actually knows what he's talking about and tries to trick him, right? But I think that the fundamental idea behind this is that, which I would argue comes from a divinatory attitude, can at least in a modern format and in a modern place maybe have to address this idea of intentionality and sincerity. I know that doesn't really answer your question, but it's a stab in the right direction. And I'm sorry, tell me the second question again.
What is Boucher-Leclerc?
Oh, Boucher-Leclerc, yes. Well, he has a whole section on kataric astrology, but this part, this quotation that I put up there is from much earlier in the book. I think what he's saying is that Mesopotamia or Egypt were the places where astrology itself is developing as these kinds of questions. And then natal astrology came after that. I mean, I have no idea if there's any, what the evidence is for that.
It's not very strong.
I don't think he's making a really strong claim. No. Pingree didn't think much of what Boucher-Leclerc wrote about kataric astrology, but I mean, and we don't look at Boucher-Leclerc enough. I think we should always be just finding out what he has to say about stuff, because there's such great material in there if you can get past the sarcasm. Yeah.
In your survey of the interrogations, the questions, have you encountered references to the planetary hours in weekdays? And does that have any role?
I would imagine that my survey, what I talked about today, was really not going much past late antiquity. So I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but maybe somebody else in the room who's done more with medieval interrogations can answer it, but I see no reason why you couldn't.
Right. It's just that I haven't seen it appear in the literature.
Yeah.
Which is curious. Just
Yeah.
because...
Well, I mean, I would expect, now that I'm thinking about it, that in elections you certainly could choose a planetary day and hour that fit the thing that you were trying to do.
Right.
For sure.
Right. But it just doesn't seem to appear in the literature so far.
Charles, do you know? Yes, it's got to be.
Okay.
Yeah, I would think it has to be. Otherwise, why have these planetary days and hours? I'm pretty sure that I've seen material in Jewish astrology, in fact. So that might be an avenue you could take a look at. Yeah.
I would say that in Serapio, who is on your list here, there are some references to the lords of the day and the hour.
Oh, good, great, thank you
Yes,
for that.
The Pole one and the other one, the Diapon, the manager
Right,
and the
right,
administrator,
right.
something
Yes.
like that.
Which Paulus, Paulus is interested in.
Yes, I would like to say two things, and one is that if you survey the CCAG, you will see that it's a huge.
Yes, and there was a finite time for research here, so work in progress.
But even a very superficial glance will reveal that most of the horoscopic astrological material transmitted anonymously is kataric.
Oh yes, no doubt.
Which shows that it was always very popular.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Yes, no argument whatsoever. Yeah.
So it's completely clear that it had very early origins.
Yes.
There is one thing I just want to say is that in my lecture in the afternoon I will talk about these questions that you mentioned on this slide.
Oh, fantastic!
Yes,
okay.
So these questions, and that I'm just releasing a full translation of this Barkus compendium, including the
Wonderful.
unedited chapters. Yeah. One more thing is that could we go to the slide where this pseudo Manito was mentioned?
Yeah. That one?
Yes. Okay. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I guess that this material comes from the Theophilus of Edessa.
I don't know. All I know is it's a Pingree apograph.
Yeah. But this is sort of an appendix in the Lopilato edition.
Yes, exactly.
But these numbers that are at the beginning resemble the numbers that appear in this untitled book of Theophilus.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, but this is unedited, but the manuscripts are available. The primary manuscripts are available on the internet. So maybe that's worth checking. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good thing to look into. Thank you. Yeah, again, I just didn't have the research time to be reading manuscripts, if I wanted to finish. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.